have web. So we're going to go ahead and navigate into web. And oh, well, that's interesting. This looks pretty similar to that of our pod, except this isn't on our pod anymore. No, no, no. This is showing us the root directory of our node. Well, how crazy do we want to get today, ladies and gentlemen? So let's go ahead. We'll change root to web. I promised you all that there would be blood today. I said that we would be nuking this node. So let's just make it happen. And I'm sure many of you are like, no, don't. I'm going to do it anyways. And I have just completely deleted. I hate to break it to y'all, but there's probably a big security concern on your Kubernetes cluster, and we're going to go ahead and break it down right now. My name's Tim Patrick, and I'm an instructor here at Alta3, and let's just get right into this. Many of you are probably familiar with what a host path volume is, and that it actually causes a significant security concern in your Kubernetes cluster. However, if you don't know, stay tuned. We're going to show the whole thing, and it includes nuking an entire node. But one thing you might not know is that recently, how we would establish a countermeasure against setting up host path nodes within our Kubernetes clusters, that method is going away. That, of course, I'm talking about a pod security policy. As of Kubernetes version 1.21, it's been deprecated, and it will be removed from Kubernetes come version 1.25. So what's replacing a pod security policy? That's called a pod security standard. And we'll go over this documentation here in a little bit. But before we do, I wanted to go ahead and demonstrate to you all the nature of this particular problem. So let's go ahead and break it down. I'm sitting here on our Alta3 Beachhead workstation, and that has come provisioned with me quite a few handy things, including worker and master nodes. Let's go ahead and just quickly show that up right here, and let me just zoom out so you can clearly see we do in fact have 3 worker nodes, all of which are in great working condition. How about that? And we'll zoom in here again, and we'll just clear this away real fast. And we're going to go ahead and make a deployment. And we're going to call this deployment Nuke. And the reason why is because it's through this deployment we're going to nuke one of those very healthy, functioning nodes. If I scroll down here, you'll notice that I happen to have a volume mount. Now, on the container, the volume mount is pathed to web. Awesome, and we're naming it test volume. Well, the volume itself is on a host path. And that host path means that it's going to be written directly onto the host. And we're mounting it directly onto root. Now, I'm pretty sure many of you are already coming to the conclusion that this is wildly scary and inappropriate, and we should never deploy something like this. Thing is that folk, when they get into Kubernetes clusters and they start working with it, they try to work in ways of which they're familiar, and they might set up these host path volumes as opposed to a persistent volume claim or even a local persistent volume, which would be better alternatives. But this happens, and sometimes we get lost in the weeds of how we should operate in a Kubernetes cluster. So this might actually exist in your clusters. You might want to double check your volume mounts. But this would be impossible to provision if we had an appropriate pod security standard. But right now, in our Kubernetes cluster, we don't. So we're going to go ahead and quit out of there, and we're just going to go ahead and apply that. Kubectl apply, and we're going to just send that out. And now our deployment nuke is created. That created for us one replica, and we see that here. We're nuke. All right, 86D, 995, CB59, doesn't really matter. All sorts of fun stuff. Now, this host path volume enables us to do a couple of different things. We're going to demonstrate this here in a second. But the big thing is that it enables us to snoop around the entire file system of our node. It also enables us to gain access to other containers that happen to be running on that node, sort of like a backdoor entry in there. And it also gives us the ability to access the certificates of kubelet, which I would imagine would be quite problematic in pretty much anybody's environment. You would never want to have that happen. And then finally, the person snooping around can also completely and totally bring your node to its knees. Let's show this off, shall we? Okay, so we're going to run a kubectl exec command, and we are going to run that to Nuke. Nice. And we'll set up a bash terminal. So now we're in our interactive session, having a good old time, and we'll go ahead and just do a quick ls. We're in the pod. That's where we are, and we can see our directory there at the bottom right above my head there. We have web, so we're going to go ahead and navigate into web. And oh, well, that's interesting. This looks pretty similar to that of our pod, except this isn't on our pod anymore. No. This is showing us the root directory of our node, of the actual machine that's running our container. Well, how crazy do we want to get today, ladies and gentlemen? So let's go ahead. We'll change root to web. Now, as we'll be able to demonstrate here, we're pretty much root. Yeah, right now on our node. We're in our node. I'm looking at all of my node's processes. You can see here we got a bunch of Kubernetes worker events running. All of the processes that are running on this machine, I can see, I have access to, I can kill them, I can do whatever I want. This whole thing is wide open to me. Ooh. Well, imagine the fun things that we get to do. Well, I promised you all that there would be blood today. I said that we would be nuking this node. So let's just make it happen. We're going to run a rm-tech rf. And we're not going to preserve root at all. There we go. We'll write that to root. And I'm sure many of you are like, no, don't. I'm going to do it anyways. And I have just completely deleted. So we went through quite a bit of this. Let's just go ahead and exit. I'm actually surprised we were still able to connect. And let's run a kubectl get nodes. And you'll notice that node 1 is not ready. It's gone. It has been nuked. So yes, we weren't able to delete everything. Yeah, we were still in there, but the node itself did suffer a massive casualty. It is not ready. As far as our Kubernetes cluster is concerned, it is offline in a non-functional state. Ooh. Now, how can we prevent this from happening? How can we prevent such a silly thing from happening in your Kubernetes cluster? Now, immediately everybody's thinking, well, no one would ever do that. Well, someone who might be a little upset today, decide they are wanting to hack into your system, cause issues, and then on the way out, nuke a node. There's all sorts of nefarious people out there who just do weird, crazy things, and we need to be ready to protect ourselves against these things. Also, sometimes you get a few folk who just don't know what they're doing, tooling around, and they make a mistake. Well, we need to be able to prevent people from making these mistakes. So here at Alta3, we have this really, really cool thing. We give everybody their own Kubernetes cluster. When they come in to take a Kubernetes class, they can set it up just like how I did. They get their own 3 master nodes and they get their own 3 worker nodes, and they go through a couple dozen labs. In fact, I teach some of these classes. It's a lot of fun. All the other instructors here do the same. And we always encourage folk to go ahead and just play around until they break it. That's fine. Because if you break your environment, we'll just give you a new one. Hey, kubectl, get nodes. What do you know? I happen to have all my nodes here ready to go instantly. How amazing is that? So now that we've done this and we've got ourselves our brand new cluster. Everything's working fine. We're going to go ahead and demonstrate that I can still make the Nuke deployment. So kubectl, apply, Nuke, boom. We've created this deployment, and if I run a git pods, we'll see that the pod did indeed be created, okay? So now we're going to stop this from happening. So let's go ahead and delete that. Now that that's gone, we're going to get into something here called a pod security standard. So a pod security standard is the Kubernetes version 1.23 and forward by default method of dealing with this. Now, you can gain access to pod security standards in Kubernetes version 1.22, but it was very much in beta and it was not enabled by default. I will make sure that there is a source down in the description below that'll tell you how you can get it turned on if you're not running on Kubernetes version 1.23 or later. But in short, pod security standards are essentially just that. They are security standards. You get 3 of them: privileged, baseline, and restricted. Now, the reason why they did this was because in the past, using a pod security policy essentially required you to set it to a role binding and a role, and then apply those to users individually in order to enact it. It became a bit burdensome and it became a bit difficult to deal with, especially if you wanted users to have different accesses, particularly across different namespaces. So what Kubernetes decided to do, or the fine folk behind Kubernetes decided to do, was we'll make it nice and easy. Your pod security standards are going to be applied on a namespace level. And you have 3 different levels of pod securities. You have privileged, you have baseline, and you have restricted. Privileged is essentially an unrestricted policy. What this means is that this is the widest possible level of permissions possible. You can pretty much do anything you want in a privileged namespace, okay? Then you have baseline. Now, baseline is pretty much minimally restrictive. This will prevent known privileged escalations and other issues like that. But the biggest thing is that it's going to give you more or less the standards, the basic standards of security policy, blanket across the entire namespace. How handy is that? And then finally, restricted. This is probably best served in our production environments where we don't want things changing at all. We would probably be in a restricted setup. But this is heavily restricted policy. This is basically the current hardening best practices across the board. Now, what these best practices are and what restrictions are applied are based upon the latest version that is available to Kubernetes in general. In fact, when we actually set these up, we actually tell it what version to use. Now, in today's examples, we'll be using latest. But the big thing here, as far as our particular issue, is that we're going to be setting up with a baseline policy this host path volume restriction, which will make the host path volume forbidden, meaning that no one can make a pod with a host path volume. That's a big deal. And let's go ahead and start setting that up in our own cluster. So we know that we're going to set this up in our own namespace. Now, I happen to be working out of the default namespace. As you can see, we have a test namespace, we have a default namespace, and we got our node release public and system. Okay? Those are our namespaces, but I want to set this up in our default namespace. Now, there's 2 ways that you can set up a pod security standard, and the first way we're going to do it is by when you stand up your namespace in the first place. I personally like to stand everything up using a manifest as opposed to using a command. So I went ahead and I took the time to put together a namespace that would have these pod security policies. So as you can see here, the only thing we've done was we added labels. That's it. There is a plugin for pod security standards that's running in the background on your Kubernetes version 1.23 and forward environments. And the only thing you have to do is label it. That plugin will find your namespaces with these labels and apply the policy to that namespace. Handy. Now you might notice that we are enforcing a baseline security policy right now. And you might notice this word here, enforce, and another word here, warn. What are these? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at this very, very good article by Lachlan Evanson. By the way, I will be linking to this article in the description down below. Check out the whole thing. He walks you through how to even set this up in Kubernetes version 1.22. Definitely worth the 6-minute read. Check it out. But here's the big thing, and this is what I wanted to point your attention to. Here we have policy modes. There are 3 policy modes that we need to be aware of: enforce, audit, and warn. Okay? Enforce is essentially the policy that will be installed. That's the policy that your namespace must follow. If there is a pod that violates the baseline policy, as an example, it will not be allowed to be created. Handy. Audit. This will enable pods of violations to be made, but there will be an audit annotation made when those pods or resources are added. And then finally, we have warn. Now, this is that a pod violates the standard, but there will just be a warning message sent. That's it. The warning message gets sent to the user, and that will be the end of it. So we can actually set up a namespace to operate on all 3 of these policy modes. For example, we can enforce on privileged, so P here for privileged, which basically makes it a fairly wide open namespace. You can do most things without any real issues. Nothing's really going to violate your rules here, okay? And then we're going to audit. This means we're going to actually keep a record, and an audit annotation will be added whenever we break a restrictive protocol. Okay, so the restrictive standard, anything that breaks restrictive, we want it to be audited. And then for baseline violations, we just want that to be given a warning. Okay, so this will just give us a warning for baseline. And we can set up all 3 of those policy modes. So knowing this, if we go back to our terminal here, we could see that we are going to enforce on the baseline, meaning the baseline standard, the middle of the road standard, okay? It's harsher than privileged, but not as harsh as restrictive, okay? We're on baseline. This will keep us from making those host path volumes. Really important. The next thing is that we're going to set it to the latest version. This is sitting out there in the world. It gets updated from time to time. There are notes in the whole 9. We're going to make sure that we are enforcing to the latest version of that baseline. If something new comes out that might break something that you're doing, you probably wouldn't want to update to the latest. We're also going to warn at the same time. We're going to warn that this happened. But, you know, if we wanted to, say, for example, audit somebody who tried to put out a resource that would violate this standard, maybe we might want to audit that instead and simply replace the word here, warn, with audit. If I could spell correctly today, which I can from time to time, it happens. And now this would be an audit instead, where an annotation would be made whenever somebody tried to provision a resource that violated our baseline standard. Okay. So how do we add a pod security standard to a namespace that's already out there in the wild and maybe wasn't created with a manifest? Maybe we just did kubectl create namespace test. Very good question. Well, the way we do this is by manually adding the labels. So let's go ahead and do a kubectl get namespace, and we want to show labels. And you can see that all of our namespaces have pretty much the label that contains their name: default, node lease, public, system, and test. That's the only label on these. So none of my namespaces at this point has a pod security standard. We need to fix this. So we could do that by using the kubectl label command. Neat. And we're just going to go ahead and we're going to label a namespace default. If I could spell correctly, that would be very, very handy. We all typo, it happens. And we're going to go ahead and set this to pod security. And forgive me for looking at my notes here. We want to make sure we type this in correctly or it won't work. So we're going to type in pod-security.kubernetes.io enforce equals baseline. Now, I will actually put these commands in the description down below, so that way you don't have to copy them down. You can just copy and paste directly from the description that's in the video below. Okay, guys, in the description down below. I want to make this very easy for you all. But now that we've done that, we're going to go ahead and press enter here, and we see that namespace default has been labeled. So if we go ahead and show our labels, we now see that we have a podsecurity.kubernetes. We've got to make sure we spell these things correctly. .io/enforce equals baseline. So right now we are actually enforcing a pod security standard in our default namespace. And that's pretty handy, but we're not quite done yet because we also need to do enforce version. And we're going to set that to latest. Okay. And we are also going to do a warn. So now we're going to do a warn equals baseline. So not only will it not work, but we'll also be warned as we do it. All right. And we're going to go ahead and do a warn version latest. All right. So now that we have all of this set up and done, if I do my show labels command, you'll see that our default namespace has the enforce, pod security, enforce version latest, pod security, enforce equals baseline, pod security warn latest, and pod security Kubernetes warn baseline. So what will happen if I go ahead and run my kubectl apply nuke? Oh my goodness, we got a warning. Would violate pod security baseline latest host path volumes. Volume test volume, so it actually tells us which volume violates the policy, and it says it won't make it. Now you still might notice though, we have that the deployment itself was made, and if I run a kubectl get pods, we'll see that the deployment might exist, but the pod doesn't. So as you can see, even though the pod didn't get made, the deployment did. And it's showing us that it has 0 pods out of 1 ready. And that 1 will never provision. It's not even trying anymore. It violated our policy. Many of you are probably saying, okay, we get it. Host path volume's bad. We need a pod security standard in order to make sure that these host path volumes don't get created in our clusters. But Tim, I got a problem. I really need a host path volume. How do I get something to work without a host path volume? Well, I mentioned this before. Host path volumes, the very concept of them are kind of anti-Kubernetes, right? Because you're writing data to a specific node directly, and these pods are ephemeral. They get deleted and then get recreated, and if they get recreated, chances are they'll be recreated on a different node, and they won't have access to that data on the other node, and now you're writing to a whole other node, and it just causes issues and problems. For the most part, host path volume should never be used. There are some who say that there are extreme edge cases for why they should be used, but I tend to disagree. There are other alternatives that more than likely would better serve your need. The first alternative to a host path volume would be a local volume. And don't worry, I will be providing the links to this documentation for you in the description down below. You'll find it there. But a local volume will represent a mounted local storage device such as a disk, partition, or directory. That would work very well. However, for most cases, I think a simple persistent volume claim would be best suited towards your need, because if the pod should die, it will still be able to tag that persistent volume claim when a new pod is created and continue working where the last pod left off. All right. Guys, thank you so much for coming by, and I appreciate you for stopping by for this Alta3 breakdown. My name's Tim Patrick. Be sure, if you've been hanging out with me this long already, why don't you come down and hang out with me a bit more? Come on down and join us in our Discord community hub, where you can ask me or any of the other instructors here at Alta3 questions about your Kubernetes cluster, and we'll actually try to help you out. We have no problems with that whatsoever. You can also follow us on Twitter, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube page as well. It's been my pleasure hanging out with you all today, and I'll see you on the next one.
This video is brought to you by Alta3 Research. We offer training solutions both on-site and online so that you can choose the method that works best for you. If you like this video, check out the links in the description box below for more information on our course offerings. Please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to see more videos like this one. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.